Hello, global gardeners. It's great to see you here on another Monday. It's a holiday Monday in the United States, so I imagine a bunch of us that are working have the day off. We'll be out in the garden, and I'm glad that you're here watching live or watching on replay. It's so nice to see everybody checking in from Oregon to Florida to Alabama to Connecticut to Ontario. Even Europe is checking in with Jean-Pierre. So nice to see you. So nice to have this opportunity to get together. We're going to talk today with a focus on some things you can do in July. For the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, I think planning is an important factor of gardening, and July is an awesome month to do that, regardless of where your garden is. Let's go ahead and start with that thought in mind. I want to bring up a comment that Penny made saying, I went and got some free pallets. I'm going to start on building my raised beds for next year. I live in an old motel turned apartment. The dirt here is not any good. Trying raised for next year. That is awesome. And that's exactly the kind of stuff I want to focus on today, because so often we get wrapped up with what we're doing in the garden right now that we don't think about next year or even next month until suddenly it happens and we find ourselves behind where we should be. So I think that's awesome, Penny, and I just wanted to highlight that because those are the kind of things that we can be doing at the peak of the gardening season. When the plants are in, when things are growing, when the beds are all in place, it's really easy on a daily basis to just go out and water and weed and do all the things that you need to do and not having a sight for the future. And so starting to acknowledge during the peak of the growing season, like we have here in the Northern Hemisphere, what you need for next year, that's what makes July so wonderful. And for the winter months, those of you in the Southern Hemisphere, same idea. You might not have any gardening activities going on outside, but you can use this time inside to start planning, preparing, and thinking about all those things that need to be done for the next season, the next growing season. So that's the focus. Thanks for Penny allowing me to use your comment to get the ball started on that, and we'll be talking much more about that as we proceed, in addition to answering your questions and just having a great community discussion over the course of the next 90 minutes. Now, I do want to offer condolences to Prepper Chris, who lost a dog who crossed the Rainbow Bridge this last week, and I feel your pain, Chris. I've been lucky enough to have 3 great gardening companions over the course of about the last 25 years. I've lost 2 of them, and Lily is getting quite old. She doesn't join me as much in the garden anymore, and when she does, she usually is hiding underneath a bush in the shade. So I hope to have as much time as I can with her, but I know her days are numbered as well. Animals are so special in so many of our lives, and when we lose them, it is extremely painful. I will throw out to you, Chris, I don't know if you've thought this, I have, to create a spot in your garden, and I think I've mentioned this before, where you can remember those special friends that you have. And so for Stranger and Shaka, I actually have their ashes, and I'll do the same thing with Lily. And as I'm building out my garden, this is all part of the planning process, I have a spot in mind of just a little memorial space where I'll have their ashes spread. I'll put up some stones and some bushes and flowers, and it'll just be a spot of remembrance for my special friends in the garden. And so that's one way that you can continue with everything you're doing normally in the garden, but just add that extra little component with your planning if you choose. And it's one of those things, I've done that in the past. Just sit in the garden and think about the special friends and the special times you had. So I'm sorry to hear that, Chris, and we are all here to support you, as you've already seen, as you move forward. And to all the rest of you with your special friends that you've lost in the past, think about that. Just having a spot of remembrance in your garden for all of those in your life, all those special friends, human and animal, that you can have a space to just sit and think back with all those memories that you have. So there you have a little bit of that. I also had a question from Gardening with Ross, wondering, what can I make with kale? Kale is one of those things that's just packed with nutrients. It's so easy to grow for many of us, but then you don't know what to do with it. Personally, I like to have kale. I'll slice it. It can be stronger and bitter than most of the lettuces I'm growing. So I'll slice it into little strips and raw and add that to salad, just like I do with mustard and arugula and mint and the other herbs, for instance, like cilantro. I'll just use little strips or little small pieces in a salad to boost the taste of the salad. So that's one thing you can do with kale. I also cook kale like spinach and saute it with some onions and garlic, which is also really good. But one of my favorite things to do, and I actually have a video on this, is to make kale chips. And so you take the leaves of the kale, you coat them with some olive oil and salt and bake them in the oven till they are dry and eat them just like potato chips. So that's actually my favorite way to eat kale, is dried as a chip. And I've got an older video in my library where I show that process of how to make kale chips. So if you're growing kale and you're not sure what to do with it, you can do all the standard cooking and eating in a salad, but try a kale chip, and I bet you'll be surprised. And the rest of you, if you've done kale chips, go ahead and put a comment in, because my guess is you like kale chips too. Okay, so nice to see everyone checking in. River and Dale are here with us today. That's awesome. Nick is wondering, is it bad to leave weeds in the garden instead of pulling them? I don't think so. Now, I will say that with a caveat. It depends on where the weed is growing. And so I've covered this in previous live streams and in videos where I let my weeds grow primarily in the periphery of the garden. So in the garden beds, I will pull the weeds. They rob nutrients, they take water, they take up space. So where I'm actively growing plants for harvesting, I'll pull the weeds. But in the rest of my garden, I let most of the plants grow. And a weed is only a plant that's growing in the wrong location. And so I have a lot of native plants that would be considered weeds if they were growing in my garden beds. But by allowing them to grow outside the beds, in pathways, along the fences, they're not weeds anymore. They're actually beneficial plants at that point. They attract insects. They offer food for animals. The rabbits, I've got a baby bunny and an adult that are still in my garden area right now. And they're not getting in the beds because they're eating the weeds. And if you think about it, a lot of those native pest animals are going to eat the native plants. And most of the weeds that are going to be popping up in the area around your garden are probably going to be a native grass or a native flower. And so those native animals are more likely to eat those native plants and stay out of your beds, especially if you've got a raised bed and hoops and bird netting to really definitely keep them out. But that's what I'm finding with my rabbits, is they're eating those weeds and not eating my garden plants. And so I think it's okay to leave weeds. Now, depending on the weed, depending on the plant, depending on whether it's a pain or a benefit to your garden, you should think in mind of cutting the tops off before they go to seed so that they don't spread too much like into your garden beds. But I just let a lot of them go, and I think that really increases the biological activity throughout my landscape by allowing some of those weeds to grow until I either extend the garden into that area and create a new bed, or I need to mulch it to put in a tree, or I'm putting a pathway, that's when I'll deal with the weeds, when it interrupts with the aesthetics in other areas of my garden. But be selective. You can let some of those plants grow, and it saves you effort because that's less weeding you have to worry about. So hope that helps out. Yeah, Kevin points out some perennial weeds can carry disease, so I try to get rid of most of the perennial weeds around the beds. So much powdery mildew and the like. And that's to my point of being selective with what the plant is. We do have some native plants here that can be weeds that are the host plant for some of the pests of other plants. So for instance, here in Colorado, we have a terrible problem with different beetles killing trees. And while the beetles are obviously, or not obviously, are hatched on other plants than the trees that they're killing. And there's a number of other insects that are in that mode as well, where they will hatch and start growing on one plant, and then they'll go and infect another plant and cause damage to it, creating the diseases that will kill it. So you raise a good point. You do have to balance what the weeds are, and the good weeds and bad weeds, and whether there's a pest in your area that could spread disease because of that particular plant. But that's all part of the gardening knowledge that you have to gain to do it best. For the most part, I let most of my plants continue to grow in the periphery and let nature balance itself out. Taco Promotions is saying, can you think of any special amending that I should do for planting sugarcane in zone 10B, South Florida? Is there any preferred time of year? And so I don't have a lot of experience growing in hot regions like that where you can grow year round pretty much. And I've grown in zone 8, but I definitely haven't grown in zone 10. So maybe someone else can throw some ideas at you. Generally speaking, when it comes to amending, organic matter is what you want to put into the soil. And when the plants are dormant or not growing is when you probably do most of your amending. So I'm not familiar with the life cycle of the sugarcane, but after you hack the sugarcane and grow it, I would think that's the time to amend. As I understand it, shortly after harvesting is when they burn the sugarcane fields, and a lot of that ash now gets back into the soil to improve the soil. That adds a potassium component. So my assumption at this point would be after harvest is probably the time that you would want to amend the soil, and it depends on your soil. A lot of the areas where sugarcane is growing get a lot of rain. That rain tends to lower the pH and create an acidic soil, and a lot of the nutrients are washed away, which is why when you add ash, which tends to raise the pH, and it adds potassium, it all begins to make sense that you would grow a crop like sugarcane, burn it, put all those nutrients back to the ground for the next crop. So that's how I would assume it works, just because of an understanding of how soil works and how pH works and how nutrients work. You can kind of draw a correlation to just about any plant when you observe what the farmers are doing with that plant. That can give you an idea of how to take care of it in your own garden. So hope that helps. If there's someone else growing sugarcane or that kind of experience, throw it out there. I'd be interested to know that too. Okay, let's see. Frank is saying, maybe a quick reminder about supplying water for your pollinators. I forgot to dump my rain gauge this week, and this morning found about 5 bees had drowned. That's a good point. I've got a couple videos on creating fountains in your garden, and in those videos I talk about one of the reasons that you should have water in your garden is for the insects, for the pollinators, for the beneficial insects and animals that are coming to your garden. They need water, and so supplying that water is important. But especially in my most recent video that I did last year, where I talked about creating a fountain for wildlife, in that video I also discuss putting a log or a rock or something else in the water so that if an insect or an animal falls in, they can crawl out. So that's a great point, Frank, that when you have a water source, you should also think about escape, just in case it gets a little overfilled because of the rain and the insects fall in. It's nice to give them an opportunity to get out, especially if it's a handful of bees, and we don't want to kill any of those beneficial insects if we can avoid it. So put something else in your water feature or in your bird bath or in the bowl that fills up with water so that they can crawl out. One of the videos I did a couple years ago where I created a leaf bowl, and one of the reasons I did that is for collecting rainwater, and for when I water, I'll fill it up so that the insects can have a drink. But I didn't seal it. And I've had some questions about that after that video. I left it as raw concrete, and so it will absorb water and the water will gradually drain through it. But that's one of the reasons I did not put a concrete sealer on that bird bath, that leaf bowl, because if you seal concrete and then it rains, it's going to hold water and there's the possibility of drowning. And so I intentionally left it so that the water will gradually seep out. So worst case scenario, when an insect does fall into that water, it has the rough concrete and a little bit of time before the concrete or until the water drains out of it. So a couple different ideas to help keep your insect and beneficials alive if you have a water feature, and you should have some water in your garden for them. Todd Main, a new member to the Gardener Scott community on the channel. Thank you so much for joining. It's nice to have you aboard, and I look forward to some of the perks that we can offer you on that community. So nice to see you here today. So that's awesome. Okay, let's see what else we can do. Heidi, you're awesome welcoming Todd to the group. Thank you so much for that. Let's see. The Mark is saying, at this time of year, I'm taking advantage of discounted prices on seeds for next year. Good, and that ties right in with the topic of the day as well. I'm going to be doing a video about it here maybe next week as I start doing some of my summer planting. But you're exactly right. The big box stores and the garden centers, most of them are starting to give the clearance sales. The seeds, most of the seeds that we are growing in our summer garden aren't selling anymore. And so it's about this time of year during summer when the retailers start putting their products on clearance, because now they've got to get ready for the fall. They're going to be closing out the garden centers here way too soon. But this is a great time as you're planning your garden for next year to take advantage of the prices that you can get on just about everything. On seeds, on pots, on compost, on fertilizer. A lot of those things that are being sold right now are going to be sold in probably just a few weeks at a reduced rate. Depending on where it is, you'll often be able to get a lot of this stuff on clearance. So good for you that you're looking at that kind of stuff. And also, a lot of the online retailers have the seeds right now and some of the plants, depending on what it is. And so we talked about this 6 months ago, where many of us were running into problems getting seeds for the season because all of the nurseries and online sellers were sold out of particular varieties. Well, now a lot of those seeds are available again, and summer can be a great time to get your seeds for next year. And most seeds can last at least a year. Most seeds, you can expect them to last for around 3 years, often more. So as you're planning next year, like we were talking about with the pallet planning for next year's raised beds, go to your garden center, go to your nurseries, and see if you can pick up some of those materials at greatly reduced prices. And most of the plants that I buy, that's what I do. I buy the plants later in the season so that I can get a lower cost on them, or I buy them usually about right now. Some of the plants that aren't flowering anymore at the big box centers, they're putting those on clearance as well, because who wants to buy a flower that doesn't have any flowers on it? Well, experienced gardeners do. If it's a perennial plant, buy it now for next year. You're not going to have flowers on it this year, but you're going to be able to have a perennial plant at a fraction of the price. Put it in the ground, you grow it this year, and next year you've got a 2-year-old plant that's going to flower even more. So there's a tip from someone who's done it a lot, and I know a lot of you are doing it as well. Phil says, really enjoyed the video on chamomile, starting a tea garden now in a new bed that's empty. What are your top 5 herbal plants? Is there enough time in zone 6B? So I'm glad you enjoyed it too. I actually enjoyed making that video. I've grown chamomile for years, and I've made chamomile tea, mostly the dried chamomile tea. And for the video, I showed using fresh chamomile flowers to make the tea fresh. And what I hadn't really noticed before, or if it happened, maybe I attributed it to something else. But when those flowers are drying, the aroma is just so wonderful. And I kept walking through, I had them on my dining room table, and I kept walking through and smelling apple pie and apple fritters and trying to figure out if I had something, because I like apple fritters. Did I have an apple fritter that I had stuck on the refrigerator and forgotten about? And I couldn't figure out where this wonderful aroma was coming from. And it was coming from the drying chamomile flowers. Because as the chamomile flowers dry, they give off this fragrance very much like an apple fritter. So it was fun making that video and just having that aroma in the house for a week as I was drying those flowers. But to answer your question, my top 5 herbal plants. So mint, and I did a video on mint a couple weeks ago. Mint is very high on my list, and I use a lot of mint fresh in salads, as I mentioned earlier, just to perk up the salad a little bit. I use thyme. Thyme is something I've grown in my garden for years and years and years. I dry it, and actually I showed that last year when I did my video on drying herbs. I showed drying thyme because I grow a lot of thyme and I dry a lot of thyme because I use it in cooking throughout the year. Chamomile is on that list because I think it's a wonderful tea. Then I start getting to some of those other herbs that it's hard to say the top 5, but I would probably say sage. I grow a lot of sage because I'll also dry the sage and use it in cooking. But one of the things I like to make at Thanksgiving is a turkey. And if you take the sage leaves and slide it underneath the skin of the turkey as it cooks, and then also if you make a stuffing using herbs like sage, that combination of the meat with that sage infusion and a stuffing with sage is just fantastic. So that's very high on my list and something that I would highly recommend as well. And then the other one that I grow a lot of is dill. And dill, it makes my top 5, not only because I use the dill leaves when I do like fish. I'll make a tartar sauce with some dill leaves that I've grown, which is really nice. I'll also use the dill heads when I make dill pickles. But dill is one of the best plants for attracting beneficial insects. And so I love growing dill in the garden. So there you have it. Those are my top 5. Those are the herbal plants that I grow consistently. Wherever the garden is, whatever garden I have, those are plants that I'm growing. So thanks for asking that. That was a good question. Okay. Frank's asking a question. Is borage good for anything other than pollinators? I know the flowers are edible. The whole plant's edible. And I'm growing it this year primarily for the pollinators as well, but you can also use the leaves and the flowers in a salad. And so, or as a, uh, you can cook them. I've never cooked the borage. I've always eaten it raw. But it is one of those things that you can just sprinkle on whatever dish you're making, especially the flowers, and it adds a nice little bright component to it. So that's what I do with it. If someone else is doing something with the borage, go ahead and throw it in the comments. But my primary reason for growing the borage is for the pollinators. And it's growing close to my water source, and the beneficials can come and get both the plant and the water that's nearby. So Paul is sharing my herbal tea garden is mint, lavender, lemongrass, lemon balm, basil, and just this morning I planted chamomile. Awesome. I'm growing all of those as well. I've got, I think, four or five different types of basil. And I would probably put basil at number 6 on my list of favorite plants. I also put basil in my salads, made some delicious pesto. And so I've got the video on garlic scape pesto. And I still had some garlic scapes that I had harvested this last week, and did a garlic scape pesto and threw in a whole bunch of basil. And it was just incredible, just an incredible pesto. So definitely love basil. I've got lemongrass growing. I started it from seed this year, and that's another great thing to grow if you like to do Thai cooking. Lemongrass is used a lot in Thai cooking, and so that's why I'm growing my lemongrass, and it just smells so good when you're growing it. So yeah, that's a great list, Paul. I agree wholeheartedly with all of that you say. Those are some wonderful ideas. And let's have a recipe. Philip's offering dill plus water or butter plus air fried chicken wings sauteed in a skillet is pretty good. There you go. I haven't done a butter dill chicken wing, but that sounds really good. And yeah, like Nick, it's making hungry talking about all of this. That's great. Melissa does a fresh basil vinaigrette, and that's a really nice idea. I like making my own vinaigrettes. As you probably know, if you've listened to the live streams, often I'll talk about making jams and jellies, and I like to make vinaigrettes with my jellies and jams that I've made from the fruits that I grow. But I like that idea of a fresh basil. Whenever you make your own vinaigrettes from your own garden produce, it's just so much better than what you buy in a bottle. So that's a great idea, Melissa. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, let's see what else. Barbara's saying, love experimenting. I'm growing cotton in Iowa. The leaves are growing and actually feel like soft cotton cloth. That's awesome. We talked a little bit about that previously. And I'm wishing you the best still, Barbara. I hope that cotton turns out great, and looking forward to what you can tell us at the end of the season for that. Laura says, I'm going out of town for several weeks. Do you have any tips for things to do to get the garden ready for not being very supervised? I have irrigation set up and someone to harvest. And so one of the things that I do and have done, we were talking about weeds before. Weeds can be a big deal, and most of us have seen that, where we'll go on vacation for a couple weeks, come back, the garden's still alive, everything's good, but the weeds have taken over. And so I would suggest be on top of your weeding before you go. And if there's an area that you need to add mulch to, go ahead and add mulch, because one of the things that I don't enjoy is coming back from a nice vacation and then seeing how overgrown the garden has gotten, and then it becomes a chore to deal with the weeds. The same with pruning any of the plants that are growing. So you can anticipate tomatoes, for instance, the indeterminate tomatoes, to really grow well in that period. Think about pruning some of the suckers and some of the tips off of your tomatoes so that they don't completely take over the garden space, especially if you're growing tomatoes with other plants. If the tomatoes take over during that time period that you're gone, it could crowd out and potentially harm those other plants near the tomatoes. And that holds true with any of the vining plants, cucumbers as well, squashes. They can take over a space in just a couple weeks. Normally you'd be there and you'd be able to direct the vines or prune off as needed, but you won't be if you're gone for several weeks. So think about those kind of things. Think about what the garden is going to look like when you return and see if you can deal with some of those issues. The watering and the harvesting and the general maintenance, if you've got that covered, that's usually what most of us think about. But what we don't think about, and it gets back to that idea of planning ahead, we don't think about what the garden's going to look like in just a few weeks, and you might be able to save yourself some major effort when you come back cleaning things up if you can do some of that ahead of time. Okay, let's see. Living life in the slow lane with Paula and Randy stopping by to check out your live. Thanks for checking in. Thanks for checking us out. Welcome to the live stream and all that we're doing here today. So I appreciate you stopping in and saying hello. I think that's awesome. Okay, let's see what else we have. We have the Brew Captain checking in. Brew Captain is another wonderful channel that I like watching. Just happens to be my son's channel, and has the day off because of the Independence Day holiday. So nice to give a shout out to the Brew Captain. He just did a 4th of July video yesterday that was pretty good with costumes and special effects and all the rest. So always nice to see the Brew Captain checking in. Chris says, I'm struggling to keep weeds out of my garden and my raised garden beds. Grass is getting in too easily. Is there an easy way to remove it, or do I remove it by hand? So easy is a relative term. So here's how I approach weeds in my beds, particularly grasses. When I water, I like hand watering. And this is a primary reason why I like to hand water. Because when I'm standing at a bed watering, on a daily basis, I'll pull out the weeds. And so I can usually keep the weeds under control in my garden beds because I'm pulling those weeds on a daily basis. That's my preferred method. Now, that being said, this year I've got a big issue with the straw. The straw that I used apparently was nothing but seeds, and I don't know that I've ever had so many straw seedlings pop up in my beds as I have in some of my beds this year. And so the approach I'm taking, they're around my tomato plants, and so the grass is not going to harm the tomatoes. It's not going to smother tomatoes. It's not going to be a big issue. I'm allowing a lot of that grass, the straw that has popped up, and I'm going to allow it to grow essentially like a cover crop over the course of this summer. And now in the fall, when I pull those tomato plants out and I amend the soil, I've got all that grass that's now going to be organic material that I'm adding back into the soil. So that's an option you probably haven't heard of before, because it's something I haven't done much of, but it's such a problem that I'm going to use the weeds, the grass weeds, as additional organic matter when I amend my beds here in just a couple months. Now, along the way, I am trying to keep it under control. I am pulling some of those grasses directly around those tomato plants, but that could be an option as well. I'm not an advocate of spraying herbicides on grasses in your active vegetable garden. So I would not suggest you try to take care of the grass by spraying a poison on it. But try to get it under control and keep pulling it on a daily basis. You can also mulch. Depending on what the bed is, you might be able to smother it and kill it with mulch, depending on what kind of grass it is. If not, you'll at least slow it down, and when you amend your bed, you've got that organic matter added back to the soil. So there's a couple ideas. Those are the approaches I take. Hand pulling is pretty much one of the things that you need to do in removing it if it's growing around your actively growing vegetable plants. If you don't mind using herbicides and it's growing in another area away from those food crops, you can make the decision on using an herbicide if the grass is bothering you that much. But as for the vegetable garden, pull it, mulch it, or let it be and add it back into the soil. Those would be my 3 suggestions. Okay, let's see. Big B, the fluffy redneck, is with us today. My preference for weeds is to use a hoe to rip them out of the ground, let the sun cook the roots, and let the weed become an ironic fertilizer for my crops. There you go. That's exactly my point. It's all organic material. If you're mowing your lawn and saving the grass clippings and putting it into your compost pile, you're adding nutrients to your compost pile. Why not do the same thing like Big B and me and let some of that grass benefit the soil where it started growing in the first place? So thanks for throwing that out there. That's awesome. Let's see. Let's talk about Tony joining us today. Tony O'Neill from Simplified Gardening is on the community. Great to have you checking in today, Tony. And you know, Tony and I are mates. We did a video together a while back, and we keep talking about doing another one, but just haven't made it happen yet. But Simplified Gardening, I know, is one of your favorite channels. A number of you tell me that. It's one of my favorite channels. It's great to have Tony here, and the hoe is definitely the best tool in the garden. I've got a couple different kind of hoes. So I did the video this last week where I talked about 10 essential tools in the garden. And I talk about the traditional hoe and my favorite for weeding, the hula hoe. And so for grasses in an area outside the plants, I use the hula hoe to just wipe out all of the grass weeds I have. But I also have some hand hoes that are only 18 inches long. The handle is only 1.5 feet long. And it is a great tool. I get in and I will hoe inside my vegetable garden beds with a hand hoe. And I have one, I'm not even sure what it's called, but it's a triangular blade, and the long edge is actually relatively sharp. And that's actually a pretty good tool for getting in under the mulch and cutting out some of the grass and some of the weeds as well. So I don't often think about that, but I need to get that tool out. And there's another way you can deal with grasses in your beds is with handheld hoes that you have really good control over around your plants. So thanks for throwing that out there, Tony, because hoes are wonderful, and they come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes, and they can be used in a number of different ways in the garden. But great to have you here today. So glad that you're joining us. That's awesome. Okay, let's see. And so Suddenly Beautifully is asking if there's a specific brand or type of hoe, because there are so many out there. There isn't a particular brand I recommend. It usually comes down to the task at hand. And so I have the stirrup hoe, where there's a brand of hula hoe that you can buy, but you don't have to buy the brand. And then I have the handheld triangular slicing hoe, and then I have the good old-fashioned hoe with the long handle and just the flat blade. I have the same basic design with a handheld, where you can get in and just chop apart plants and cultivate the soil a little bit. So there's a number of different types of hoes out there. There's actually circular hoes. I don't have one. It's a lot like the hula hoe, where you got the long handle, and at the end it's a circle, and that's also great. And you can get good control with using a circular hoe in the garden. So can't recommend a brand, but I will say, depending on the task at hand, you can specialize and get a hoe that meets your specific needs. Most of us start off with just the basic classic flat hoe, and that will be good for most of the things that you need to do. But for weeding, that's when you can get into some of these specialized hoes to really take care of whether it's a bed that's got plants growing in it, or it's an open area and you want to clear out all the weeds pretty quickly. Lots of different options there. Okay, let's see. Chris Ryan is asking, what are my thoughts about, I think you're asking, burning pallet wood and other scrap wood to create mycelium, or burring. If you're asking about burring, like getting a sanding device, or there is a tool that you can do to scrape the wood. So if you're talking about burring the wood, and actually I think that may be a more appropriate, because you're talking about creating mycelium. So if that's what it is, I'll assume that, and you can clarify if I've got the right idea for your question. So first off, pallet wood, there are different types of pallet woods. And so pallets come in a couple different types. And so the one type of pallet is regionally constructed. And so like here in the United States, there are a number of companies within the United States that make their pallets and use them within the state or within the region. And there aren't a lot of regulations about that type of wood. So they can use wood, and then they make a pallet, ship it until the pallet falls apart. Those kind of pallets are great to use for raised beds, for chopping up and using as a mulch, for scraping into smaller pieces like burrs and putting that on or in your soil. There's no issues with those. But the other kind of pallets, the international pallets, the ones that are being used for shipping from one country to another, those are treated with pesticides. And there's usually a stamp on the pallet that tells you exactly how it's been treated. Those you have to be careful about, because if you use those type of pallets anywhere in your garden, it's been treated with a pesticide, because the idea is they don't want to ship from one country to another and have an insect pest living in the pallet. So it's treated to kill anything that might try to burrow into that pallet. So you have to be careful about some of those. But the concept of using wood to encourage mycelium. So now mycelium, those little white fragments, if you're using a wood chip mulch and you pull it aside and you see all that white spider web that's growing underneath your mulch, that's a fungal mycelial network. And so the mycelium is breaking apart the woody material. It's the fungus that's feeding on the wood. So if you can have a pallet that you know to be free of pesticides, and then chip it up or shred it or use it in some way in the soil, or probably better yet as a mulch, it can be a great way to increase the fungal activity in your soil overall. And that happens through the spread of the mycelial network. So I hope that answers your question. I'm going to scroll down. Oh, there you go. You're saying burying the pallet. So same basic idea. So everything I just said, if you bury the wood, the fungus is what's going to break it down. Wood is broken down by fungus, not so much by bacteria. And it can be a great way to create the mycelial network. Now, carrying this a step further, and I took a lot of pictures, and I'm not sure how I'm going to include it in a future video, but the tree I cut down in my front yard that I've referenced in the past in some of my videos, this year, because we had such a wet June, where the roots were for that tree, because the tree is now dead, the stump is dead, the roots are dying, I had hundreds and hundreds of mushrooms popping up, because those buried roots are now being decomposed by the fungi. And so, yes, you can bury the pallets or any type of wood, and the fungus will find it and begin to feed on it. You can see that with the fruiting bodies of the fungus, which is what a mushroom is. And that will increase the fungal activity in your soil. So yes, that can be something that you can try. And I think an easier way and probably a quicker way is to use the pallets or whatever the wood material is on top of the soil as a mulch, and you'll still get an increase in some of the fungal activity, and you'll get all the benefits of the mulch. So there you have it. Pat, nice to see you here today. The philosophy of planting trees that you will never sit in the shade of has changed my gardening world. Well, I'm glad to hear that. There are so many plants that we grow for our own benefit, and I think that's awesome. But that's interesting you say that. And I actually am going to talk a little bit. I'll bring that into the philosophy that that I'm planning to talk about at the end of the day. So it's planning for the future, and that's the theme for today, is planning for the future. And the future may be long-term future. I am planning areas of my garden that I know I won't be using for 5 more years. And I'm also anticipating 10 and 15 years out, whether I'm still here or not, those areas of my garden that can be used then to really enjoy that garden space. So planting trees that you will never sit in the shade of is one of those things that I think it is a nice thought, and I'm glad to hear you say that it's changed your gardening world, because it also has changed how I approach gardening as well. Looking to the future, planning for the future, and it all starts today. The best time to plant a tree is today, regardless of what kind of tree and what your plan is. Get some trees in your landscape. So thank you for sharing that, Pat. That's nice. Okay, I'm scrolling down. I see that Lars has given a nice contribution super chat. Thank you so much for that. Would natural pollinators be squeezed out by adding a bee cube for honey? And how do beekeepers deal with areas with a lot of rhododendrons? Interesting. And so I don't know, unless, so a couple different questions. No, I don't think natural pollinators are going to be squeezed out. So you have to think about the different types of pollinators. And so if bees become a dominant pollinator in a garden, there are still a number of other flowers that bees don't go to. And so I'll have a video. I'm thinking about doing a video about this in the winter because it's just fascinating. You know, I love the science of gardening. And so the colors of flowers, and more importantly, the ultraviolet colors of flowers, attract different pollinators. And so bees don't pollinate all flowers. They are attracted to some flowers more than others. And that's the way that you would approach a problem, if you see it as a problem. If you have too many bees, if you are a beekeeper, if you live next door to a beekeeper, just grow variety. Just grow as many different types of plants and flowers that you can, and the bees will not push out other pollinators, because those other pollinators are looking for different types of flowers, like dill, for instance. Bees are not a big feeder on dill. They can be big feeders on sunflowers. And so grow dill to attract lacewings, for instance, which are a great beneficial insect. But grow sunflowers for the bees. So you can really mix up your garden and not worry about bees taking over. And as far as the beekeepers, a lot of it depends on where the hives are. So for instance, in California, you may be aware that they have traveling beehives. It's a big business where these beekeepers will have a semi-truck loaded with hives, and they'll pull up into an orchard, open up the truck, let the bees pollinate the orchard, shut up the truck, drive a few miles up the road and do the same thing. And they rent out the bees to the farmers in California in particular, because there are some crops that do rely on the bees. They're heavily pollinated by the bees. But as far as worrying about a particular flower, I've never heard or read that that's an issue, because bees regularly will travel half a mile in a day looking for different flowers to feed on. And so if you or your neighbor has a lot of rhododendrons, there's a lot of other flowers within a half-mile radius that those bees are going to be feeding on and looking for as well. So no, I don't think it's an issue that they have to deal with just because of the variety and other flowers that the bees will find that they have a preference for. It does raise an issue when you are choosing your flowers. Think about the pollinators. There's a lot of beautiful flowers that you can buy that are double blossoms. Well, a lot of those hybrid flowers will not be pollinated by anything, because especially these double blossom flowers, they're man-made. They're a hybrid to be beautiful, but they don't match up with how insects pollinate. And so while you can grow some of those for the beauty in the garden, those are not the kind of flowers to grow for the pollinators. For the pollinators, you want to grow a lot of the traditional plants that have been in gardens for hundreds of years, and particularly the native ones in your area that your native bees will like. So native flowers and native bees go well together. Growing hybrids for the purpose of attracting pollinators typically doesn't work as well. So hope that helps out, Lars, and gives you some ideas. But I wouldn't be too concerned about it. Just have a lot of variety and your bees will be fine. So, okay, we have Yankee Sista checking in. Always nice to have Yankee Sista from Connecticut, part of our Mondays. You're just such a nice fan, viewer, contributor, and I love having you here. Thank you so much for that contribution. I have many tomato and pepper plants. Should I just plant them as succession plants? Don't want to run out of time, zone 6. I say yes, go ahead and plant them. You might not get a fully mature fruit depending on the variety that you're growing, but if you have them, go ahead and put them in the ground. And I put a bunch of my tomatoes in later than I would have preferred for the same reason. I had them, and maybe I'll get some fruit on those, maybe I won't, but if you've got the space and you've got the plants, go ahead and give it a shot. And peppers are ripe when they turn colors, but you can still use green peppers in cooking or whatever the reason is that you're growing the peppers. And the same with tomatoes. When your frost comes, whenever that might be, if you've got green excuse me, tomatoes, you can still use them. And so I say go for it. Go ahead and plant them. Oh, that swallow went down the wrong way. And so we've talked about succession planting previously, and so this ties in with it. This time of year, for those of us with an active growing season, succession planting is definitely should be part of your summer planning. And this plays in with one of the things I want to talk about today. When you're talking about tomatoes and peppers from Yankee Sista, you have to look at the length of your growing season. When is your first frost date in fall? And are the plants you're putting in going to be able to grow for a long enough period to give you the fruit? And that's why I say the peppers and the tomatoes, maybe not. But there's a lot of other plants you can grow, like cucumbers and even a lot of squashes that will give you fruit in a quicker period of time. You can definitely put those in right now as part of succession planting. Ideally, you would have planned for that a few months ago so that you would have gotten the seeds, had the bed ready to go, known that you were going to be finishing one harvest and starting another. And so that's what I'm doing right now. My bed with the lettuce and the radish and the mustard, that bed is fading fast in the hot days that have returned finally. Those plants are going to be either harvested or pulled because they're bolting, and I'm putting in new plants. That was part of my plan for months now, that bed was going to be transitioned into succession planting with new crops. as you in July start thinking about succession planting, think about your fall garden. And this is a key time of year to get the seeds for the plants that can handle that cold weather. And so the first frost date will kill the peppers, and they'll kill the tomatoes, they'll kill the cucumbers when that frost hits. But it's not going to harm the spinach and the Swiss chard and the lettuce and the turnips. Those plants can handle cool conditions. Those are the seeds that you should be thinking about putting in your garden right now. You're planning for the fall by putting the seeds in during the summer months. You'll probably need some shade cloth because a lot of those plants won't germinate if the soil is too hot. And so you've got your bed ready to go. Go ahead and start putting some of those seeds in a shady area. Now, here's a thought. Put those seeds around some of your actively growing summer plants. So for instance, and I'll have a video coming out here in a few weeks about this, my tomato plants I have in beds where I've got a tomato plant and about 18 inches next to it, another tomato plant, and about 18 inches next to it, another tomato plant. And so in the big square bed area that I just constructed, I've got tomatoes down that whole row of beds on two different sides. And that's all that's growing there right now is just the tomato plants. Because part of my planning process is that in July, I'm going to put in some of my fall crops right next to the tomato plants. And so it's going to take them a month or two to germinate and start growing. That's going to be the peak time of year that my tomatoes are going to be producing. Now the tomato plants will help shade some of those plants that don't like a lot of heat. A couple months from now, when I have my first frost and the tomato plants die, I just cut down the tomato plants and that whole bed area can be taken over by the spinach and the chard and the broccoli and all those other plants that can handle some cool conditions. So too often we think of just a bed as being plantings right now, and then when all those plants are gone, we'll add new plants. Then when all those plants are gone, we'll add new plants. Well, go ahead and start interspersing some of your fall crops into the same bed that you're growing your summer crops. And this might be a new idea for you, and I haven't seen a lot of discussion about it, which is why I want to do a video here pretty soon to talk about this idea that you can start putting plants in the same beds that you're actively growing in right now, anticipating that those plants growing right now are going to die when the frost comes, and those seeds you're putting in are going to survive when the frost comes. And now you're overlapping your plantings and really maximizing the space you have and being able to grow as much as you can. So there you have it. Okay, Lilak Ananiev, I hope I was able to pronounce that close. Thank you so much for that contribution. I appreciate it. Welcome to the chat, and glad that you're here today. Thanks so much for contributing and supporting the Gardener Cot channel. I really appreciate that. That's very nice. Thank you. Okay, let's scroll back down and see if I can get caught up with where we're at. Lots of good information today. I hope I'm giving you some new stuff. I know so often we talk a lot of the same things because we have a lot of new gardeners checking in. We have a lot of new people discovering the Gardener Scott channel, and a lot of the questions are the same that we've talked about before. But I do try to throw in some of the new information as much as possible, especially for those of you that might be a little more experienced that haven't tried some of these things. So always happy to help the new people, and always striving to broaden the world of the experienced gardeners as well. So I hope I'm helping you out with both those ends today. Okay, let's see. Rachel McGraw is saying, I take the attractant out of the bag and put packing tape over it. It will hold well without drawing beetles to the garage in between treatments. Okay, good. I'm guessing there's some good conversation going back and forth about traps and attracting the insects in particular. And so beetle traps in particular, when I had the video a little while back when I was talking about different ways that you can organically deal with pests in your garden, traps are one of the ways to do that. So thank you for that input, Rachel. Appreciate you helping others out. Laura's saying, I'll probably sow some fall seeds before I leave for my trip, so they might be up by the time I come back. There you go. That's something to think about. And especially talking about when you go on a trip and there's a concern about the weeds in some of those more bare areas of your garden, that is a way to anticipate the weeds. If you can put new plants in, they'll help crowd out any weeds that might appear as well. So there you go. Hope that works for you. Hello, Sandra from Tennessee. Nice to have you. I see that Kiri Nowak has joined on today. Another great moderator in addition to Jay and Heidi. Moderators are so great. Kiri just happens to be my daughter, so I'll give her props as being my favorite moderator because I've known her the longest. Wink, wink. Okay, nice to have everybody checking in. And the holiday Mondays are nice because we can have a lot of people on the live streams that don't normally get a chance to be here. And it's nice to have everybody that can be here checking in on this holiday day in the United States. Mark, watching from Independence, Missouri, Zone 6, home of Harry S. Truman. I read that book a while back. If you haven't read the book Truman, it is an homage to Independence. And I've driven through Independence, but I haven't actually. I think the Harry S. Truman home is a museum, if I remember right. So glad to have you here today, Mark. And I'll have to make a trip to Independence. It's about a day's drive from me. I'll add it to my list of things to do. Tony, thank you for that. Love the live streams when I can get here. And as always, anyone that can get here is welcome. And if you only watch us on replay, that's an option too. One of the reasons I like Kiri as a moderator is she's the one that puts together the timestamps. And so you can go back to previous live streams and there's a timestamp of all of the different topics we talk about. And though I would love you to watch the entire live stream in replay, if you can't be here live, you can use it as a great reference source and go straight to a particular topic that we've talked about. So you can go back in the library and just look at the timestamps in the description of that chat and just pick and choose with some of the topics that we happen to be discussing on that particular day. So there's another option. But being here live, yeah, it's definitely a great way to get things going. Patina says, was late in starting parsnips, need 60 to 65 degrees to germinate. Raised beds were at 80, started them in trays with ice cubes and transplanted. Not supposed to do well, but doing great in beds. That's awesome. Same idea. Parsnips tend to have a longer season. And so a key recommendation if you want to grow parsnips is to start them in the summer and then allow them to grow as the temperatures are cooling, and then you'll harvest them in the fall. Parsnips, most parsnip varieties have a longer days to harvest than other root vegetables. So you might be able to get beets and turnips in 60 or 70 days, but you're probably going to need 100 or 110 days to get your parsnips. And so summer's the time to do that. So wish you the best on your parsnips. That's a fun crop to grow. I used to really like growing parsnips at the school garden and then having the students come out to harvest because it was always fun. This is another one of those activities you can do to get kids excited in the garden. Have kids harvest carrots and show them how to harvest carrots. And then take them to a bed of parsnips, especially parsnips that you know are 12, 15, 18 inches long, and then have the kids harvest the parsnips. And that's a fun experience to just sit back and watch because they don't anticipate that they're going to have this huge root that they pull out of the ground. And when they do, invariably, they are excited at the size of that root. And so parsnips are a fun crop to grow. In addition to eating, I like to actually have turnips and parsnips and beets and potatoes and roast them all together with some of my own fresh thyme and some olive oil. And so that's one of my favorite dishes in the fall is a root vegetable that are root roasted vegetables with some of my herbs that I've harvested as well. Just absolutely delicious. And parsnips play into that. Parsnips are also great. I'll boil parsnips along with potatoes and make mashed potatoes with the parsnips mashed up within the potatoes as well. So this is a great show today. We're getting lots of recipe ideas and lots of food things that maybe you hadn't thought about before. So there you go. Great ideas that we can throw out there. Nicole saying, my carrots did nothing this year, just tiny little things. My question to you would be, have you been exposed to a lot of this heat that many of us have been exposed to? Because carrots will get stressed. In normal conditions, the carrots will be growing and the roots will start growing. But I saw that on a lot of my root crops so far, to include some of my carrots. It just got so hot so quickly that those root vegetable plants were stressed. And now they're not putting the energy into the root, they're putting the energy into just surviving and staying alive and growing the foliage, growing the leaves, and the root suffers in that case. So that could be the issue that you're having, is that it's just been too hot. And you may see that with a lot of other root vegetables this year as well. Florida girl says, not planting carrots till the end of September. I'm actually going to, under shade cloth, start some carrot seeds here in just a couple weeks. And so again, it's the concept that it's too hot for them. And so I'm going to germinate them under some shade cloth. My season is so short that it really has to happen in July. To plan the fall garden in July is really what I need to do. But if you've got a longer season, absolutely wait until September and then start those fall plantings. If you're growing garlic, I'll be harvesting my garlic in another week. Maybe you just harvested your garlic, or like me, you're close to harvesting your garlic. Add that to one of those beds. What are you going to do with it next? Have you thought about that? You should have a plan for what you're going to put in your bed when you harvest something like garlic. If you don't, think about it right now. And that's why I say I'm going to be starting carrot seeds under shade in just a couple weeks, because that's the bed they're going into, the bed that I just harvested the garlic from. So it's all about planning, all about moving forward, all about just keeping the sequence going and trying to get as much as you can during the growing season so that you can keep growing. Tony says his is due next week. So Tony, what's going in next? With that same thought in mind, and I value Tony's opinion, as do most of you. Yours is due next week. What are you going to put in your beds, your garlic beds, after you harvest the garlic? And how are you going to continue the season? Tony lives in Wales in the UK and has a completely different season than mine, but a lot of those same considerations as far as succession planting. We grow a lot of the similar plants. My potatoes, I'll be harvesting potatoes here pretty soon. Most of my potatoes I'm growing in grow bags. Same thing. Once those potatoes are harvested, what goes in the grow bag or the container? Depending on how you're gardening, what are you going to grow in that container next? And containers give you even more options, because you can move the containers around and you can put something in its place that when the weather does get cold, you can bring it inside. So you might be able to do squashes and cucumbers in a grow bag or container that you were growing potatoes in, and then just bring it into a protected spot when the weather changes and gets cold, and extend your season that way. So there you go. Chard, another cool season plant. Tony's putting chard in place of the garlic. So good choice. I think that'll work well, and I anticipate you'll do it. Chris, good question. You know everything. I don't know everything. I know a lot because I've been gardening for decades, and I'm constantly learning and trying new things. And that's how, luckily, I have a good enough memory that I can remember a lot of this knowledge. But thank you for that. What was your biggest failure Um, we have had one. So the biggest failure, I would say, and I've talked a little bit about this in the past, but it's when I lived in Oklahoma, and so I was relatively new to gardening, and so we had lived in Montana. For those of you that don't know, I had a career in the United States Air Force, and we traveled around the country. And so if the brew captain is still on, he can make a comment about that, and Kiri Nowak can make a comment about it. But some of their earliest memories are of the garden we had in Montana. And I started growing a few things there. And then we moved to California. And we're in the San Joaquin Valley of California, where everything grows without even trying. And I remember growing jalapenos. I had a couple jalapeno pepper plants. And I think, as I remember, I had 2 plants. And those 2 plants gave me bushels of peppers. I've never harvested so many peppers as I did from those plants that I was growing in California. And then we moved to Oklahoma, which had a nice warm climate. I think it was zone 6, maybe zone 7. I think it was a zone 6. And I started a garden there. The normal progression, I'd learned a little bit in Montana. I had great success in California. I was looking to more success in Oklahoma. What I didn't anticipate is that Oklahoma has insect pests like no other place on the planet. And I could never grow a successful garden in Oklahoma because I just didn't have the skills. I didn't have the knowledge yet, and I didn't know what was going on. And so my biggest failure was one garden in particular, but essentially all the gardens that I attempted to grow in Oklahoma. We were there for, I think, 3 summers and really harvested nothing, because the insects and the animals just ate everything. So that was my biggest failure. And that was one reason why we moved to Colorado from Oklahoma. That's one reason why when I moved here to Colorado, I took it upon myself to learn more, and specifically to learn about Colorado and the pests we have here, the animal pests and the insect pests, to learn about the soil, to learn about what you need to do to get a successful garden. And that's when my knowledge really exploded, because based on that failure in Oklahoma, I now had not only a mission in life to learn more about gardening, but I had that motivation. I saw what happens when you don't know what's going on, and anticipated what could happen when you do know what's going on. So sometimes the biggest gardening failures can lead to the biggest gardening successes. And I would put my gardening journey into that category. My biggest success led to me being here today, sharing all of this wisdom that I've learned, because I had such dismal failure in those gardens in Oklahoma. Nothing against Oklahoma. They grow a lot in Oklahoma. In that particular area of Oklahoma, cotton was king. There were cotton fields everywhere. And I actually learned a little bit about growing cotton. Cotton is also one of those crops that's grown and has more pesticides on it than just about any other crop. That was part of my gardening journey, to learn about pesticides, and why now I'm not a fan of pesticides, because some of the people I knew back then in Oklahoma that had gardens or attempted to grow gardens couldn't grow a garden because it was too close to a cotton field, and the cotton fields were sprayed with pesticides and herbicides. So just the craziness. But failure can lead to a knowledge gain and great success, and that's where my story led me. But thanks for asking that, because that is one of those things that we all should look upon, the failures we have all the time, and anticipate what we can learn from it and how we can move forward with it. So just a couple thoughts along those ideas. And as Tony says, never a failure, just a learning opportunity. I completely agree. That's my basic philosophy. And you've heard me say it before. It's my philosophy of gardening as well. that's how you become better gardeners. And you can look at some of Tony's been making videos for years and years as well on the Simplify Gardening channel, and you can look back on a lot of Tony's videos. In fact, he has one recently where he's doing a garden tour, and he'll talk about the things that don't go wrong and the things that don't look pretty, and those are great lessons for all of us. And that's why I do the same thing, is to share my failures and the things that don't go right, because you all can learn from what I do. I don't know everything, and I don't do everything right. I continually learn on a daily basis in my garden, which is why I encourage you to do the same, to get out there and try to learn something new every single day in your garden. And chamomile, for instance, since that's the video I did this last weekend, I'd never paid as close attention to the blossoms of the chamomile until I was making a video about it. I've waited till the blossoms open and harvested in late morning to make tea. But when you look at and it's not just chamomile, because I noticed the same thing on my California poppies. Once you notice something, you start seeing it everywhere in your garden. But I noticed that the chamomile flower petals will droop. They'll be lower in the morning. And then over the course of the day, as the sun comes out, those petals will spread out, and the chamomile flowers will be vibrant and fully open for the day. Well, a lot of other flowers are that way too. My California poppy flowers, same thing. They're closed up in the morning and they open up during the day. And so those are the kind of things that I continue to learn. I may see it in one flower and never have recognized it in another flower. And things like that happen throughout the garden. So expose yourself to those learning opportunities. It's not always a failure. It always is. A failure should always lead to learning something new, but sometimes it's just increasing your observation that can lead to learning something new as well. Making a point to see something that you didn't see before is often educational as well. Okay, let's see what else, if we have any other questions popping up before we finish up. And yeah, Janan, the blossoms are just so amazing. Like I talked about earlier, that sweet apple fragrance of the chamomile is amazing. And I'll be growing a lot more for that fragrance. And you can't, there's just so many, depending on how much chamomile you grow, it's hard to harvest all the flowers. And so you can harvest a lot and make a lot of tea, but just leaving the flowers in place so that you can walk by and just kind of brush against those flowers, it's a wonderful way to do it. So let's see what else we have. I'm going to scroll up a little bit. There we go. Tony's saying, put your camera on, taking a pic every 1 minute and watch the garden wake up through the day. Great idea. And I actually have one of those cameras that I don't use that's intended to do that. But great idea, Tony. I appreciate that. I typically will do like a morning, an afternoon, and an evening. But yeah, to set a time sequence like that, that's an awesome idea. The garden is just so amazing. Just so amazing to see what is happening in your garden. Again, the observation. You just don't see it because we're often out at the same time each day. And so during the course of the summer, most of us are gardening in the morning because we don't want to be out in the sun. Or maybe we're gardening in the evening after things cool down. So you miss a lot of what's happening in the garden during those times that you're typically not in the garden. And that's where the observation comes in, because you may see insects and animals and plants reacting to the full sun that you won't see otherwise. So get out in the garden at a time that you aren't normally in the garden, and you might be surprised at what you see. Okay, let's see what else we have. Walk With Me Homestead is saying, trying to learn grow zones. I'm in Southeast Texas. Lots of experienced growers I watch are around zone 6, trying to learn how long I have to wait longer before placing plants that don't like heat. And so a couple good issues to talk about there. And so first off, know your hardiness zone. And zone 6 is great. It gives you lots of options for plants that you can grow. But more importantly, and I've talked about this before, understand how the hardiness zone or your particular season length work together, because they're different things. And so in the summer, when you're actively growing your vegetable garden, the zone really doesn't matter. The hardiness zones have to deal with the lowest average winter temperature. And so the zones that we often refer to, I'm zone 5B. We were talking earlier about zone 6 or zone 10 in Florida. Now we're talking about zone 6. That's all about how cold your winter gets. And that determines what kind of trees you can grow, what kind of perennial plants you can grow, what kind of fruit bushes you can grow, even things as simple as garlic. In zone 7 to 9, it's very difficult to grow garlic. And so we can talk about growing garlic in Colorado or Wales, but you can't grow garlic in southern Florida. You just can't. In zone 7 and 8, maybe 9, you can grow a Creole variety of garlic. And that's about the only variety that will do well in that heat. And so in that respect, the garlic, which has to overwinter, the zone becomes a factor. But for cucumbers and tomatoes and peppers and squashes and all the other plants we're growing in our vegetable garden, the zone means nothing. It's the length of your growing season that is the primary factor, and how hot it gets as a high temperature in the summer as to which plant you're growing at which time of year. So you'll be growing those cool season plants typically in the spring and in the fall because they can't handle the heat of summer. And you'll be growing those warm season plants that can't handle any cold, not in the spring and not in the fall, but during the summer. And if you're new to an area and you're trying to learn how your growing season and how your hardiness zone influences what you can grow in your garden, I say go to a local nursery, make some friends, and establish a gardening community, join a gardening club, go to master gardener classes, and ask questions. Not how do you grow a tomato, but how do you grow a tomato here where I live? How can I grow a pepper plant in my garden? And a lot of that comes down to specific varieties to match the climate in your area. That's the best way to have success, is to match your plants with your climate based on what you've learned from local gardeners who have had success. You can learn from me and a lot of other gardening channels to give you basic ideas. But when it comes to your individual garden, your garden is going to be different than what all of ours is. And that will help you have the best success. So I wish you luck on the homestead, and I hope you can get some of those things selected that will do well for you, and see what everyone else in your area is doing. That should give you some relatively good ideas. Florida girl says, when you tell me I can't, then it motivates me, but there are things you can't grow. Though I've sprouted a coconut and mangoes from seed. That's awesome. In Florida, you can probably sprout coconuts and mangoes with a little bit of effort. That's definitely something you can't do in Colorado. So that's good. That's a good motivation. If you can't do it, then find out how you can do it. Another great way to learn gardening is to learn why something that won't work. I know why mangoes won't grow in Colorado, and it's just expanded my knowledge base. What doesn't work can give you as much information as what does work. So good. Thanks for throwing that out there. And so as we draw to a close today, let's talk about something that's been on my mind, and there are a few of you made comments about my chamomile video. And so in my chamomile video, I end the video sitting in my newest garden area where I have cosmos flowers that are starting to bloom and some poppies. The calendula's coming up great. the plants in that area are wonderful. And that's the backdrop as I'm sitting on the bench enjoying a cup of fresh chamomile tea. And that really got me thinking what I was going to talk about today in the philosophy phase, because even though I say get out and enjoy your garden, I think too often we don't. And when we do, it's going out and sitting on a bench and enjoying chamomile tea and just enjoying the moment. But what that moment, sitting on that bench, drinking that chamomile tea, what that moment really elicited for me was thinking back to all those other moments of sitting in the garden with the animal friends. I think back to like we started talking about Chris's loss. I think about those moments where I'm sitting on a garden bed, or I'm sitting on the ground, or I'm sitting on a bench with one of my special friends after a good hard day in the garden. Or in the morning when I've got a cup of tea, sitting out there just listening to the birds and watching the garden wake up. And so while you should definitely plan for those moments in the future and where you're going to do it and build out your garden space so you have those benches and you have those shady areas and you have those flower spots, reminisce, look back, think to those moments in the past that you enjoyed. And it just becomes cumulative. Each time I'm sitting in the garden enjoying what the garden is bringing me in that moment, it brings up some of those memories of past times when I was enjoying the garden. And especially when you're a new gardener, start building those moments, because as I'm encouraging you to do, reminisce, build those moments now. So in the future, when you look back and when you reminisce about the successes and the failures and the high points and the low points, when you reminisce about your gardening journey and about those special moments in the garden, they just build upon themselves. And this is what I found when I was doing this video. The intent was just to sit on the bench and enjoy a cup of tea, film the video, and just observe the garden. And before I knew it, I'd been there about 45 minutes because I was just reminiscing. I was thinking about that bench. I've had that bench for over 20 years, and I've moved it to 5 different garden spaces. And I didn't sit on that bench much 20 years ago because I was just building the garden and I was focused on the construction, and I put it in place and I didn't get all the flowers in. And so I didn't use that spot as a spot to reminisce. Now it is. Now I can enjoy the garden from a number of different perceptions on that bench. And that's what I'm suggesting you do. Build a spot right now so you can create some of those memories right now. Don't build everything for 5 years from now. Don't wait 5 years until you enjoy your garden and look back. Start building those moments and start looking back right now. The garden is just such a wonderful place to evoke so many of those thoughts and so many of those memories that you should take advantage of it. The summer is a time for many of us that are working hard in the garden, and the winter for others of us that aren't doing any work in the garden. And we lose sight of why we should be doing a lot of it. Get out in the garden right now, summer or winter, whether you have that spot created or not. Get out in your garden and bring up some of those memories that can motivate you and take you forward into the next season, whatever that season happens to be, whether it's fall or spring. It's some of these memories right now that can really get us going for the next season. It might be a prompt to, oh yeah, I was going to do a pallet raised bed this year. I better get started on that. Whatever that memory is that you bring up just by being in the garden, you got to be in the garden to bring some of those memories up. And that's what I want to throw out at you today. Get out in the garden, reminisce, think back to whatever the memory happens to be, because it will shape your gardening journey for tomorrow and next week and 5 years down the road. It's just one of those things that we just keep moving down the path, and all these little things on the path are what make the journey enjoyable. And I think memories play a big role in the garden. So Chris, get out in your garden. I know you're grieving. I know this is a tough time, but use this opportunity to think back, to reminisce about your special dog, and bring up some of those memories that you want to remember, because they'll fade if you don't make a point to remember them. And that's what I'm going to do today. I'm actually going to get out there and bring up some of those thoughts I have of Stranger and Shaka and Lily as I spend some time in the garden today. Think about that. I hope you can use that as you continue on your journey. Chris, thank you so much for that contribution. And I know a lot of us have been giving you loves and support today. I hope you have a good week ahead. And I hope everybody has a good week ahead. Next Monday, I'll be here at the same time. I look forward to seeing you here. Hopefully, I've given you some thoughts to push you further on your gardening journey, and the information that you get every Monday to help you become a better gardener. That's what it's all about. Thank you so much, everybody, for all your contributions and being here. We'll see you next week. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.